school was okay. People say the days at school are the best days of your life. For me, I wouldn't agree. I don't think I was bottom of the class, but I wasn't a star at school. And then when it came to exam time, I took all my exams. I failed a lot. So that was in the fifth form in those days. So that would have been the age of 16. And I failed a lot. So my dad put me back through the same year all again. So I went back to school and redid the fifth form. The school was a small school, and each class had 12, 13 people in it. And I knew all the people in the form below. And I went back. And it was, I think, the best thing that my dad ever did, because it set me up for my career. Because I went back to school, not feeling like the bottom of the class, not feeling what anything. But I went back, I was made deputy head boy. I was the school swimming captain, and I sort of had some authority. I now know that that was a turning point in my life. I failed all my exams again the second time. But going back for that second year, I grew up and I left school at the age of 17 in July 1971.
When you left school, wasn't this around the time where you first heard about what this career of being a clerk was?
So just winding back to my passion was always aeroplanes. I used to go to London Gatwick Airport, London Heathrow, as a 5-year-old in short trousers, standing there. I had a Ian Allen, as it's called, aircraft spotters book, and I used to tick off every aeroplane's registration number. So I had this passion for aeroplanes. And one thing that I always wanted to do was to be an airline pilot. But of course, having failed everything at school twice was no option. And because of flying, I was passionate about travel and seeing the world. And I tried to join the travel industry. I applied to then Thomas Cook, and that didn't work either. So I was a bit of a loss. I did not know what I wanted to do. And in April or May of 1971, I went to somewhere called the Fairfield Halls in Croydon, which is south of London. And my mum and dad, and maybe my brother and sister, I can't remember. And the couple that joined us was a couple called Rosalind and Keith Goodfellow. And we knew them through the church. They didn't live in our area. They lived out west in Surrey, but he was a QC. Now, QC meant nothing to me, but Keith Goodfellow. And he was a construction QC. He came from Chambers at 22 Old Buildings, now known as Atkin Chambers. And he was one of the stars of the construction bar. None of that meant anything, but that's his background. And I can remember walking up the stairs into the auditorium, and he said, "What am I going to do when I leave school?" And I said, "I've tried this, I've tried that, and I really don't know." And he said, "Well, what you should do is come to London and meet my clerk." And his clerk was called Robert Allen. And I thought this was a good thing, but getting on the train, going to London on my own, which probably I hadn't done before, I don't know, and walking up Fleet Street and then turning up to Lincoln's Inn. He was at 22 Old Buildings to meet Robert. Robert, I imagine he was in his mid-40s, early 50s, and we chatted, told me a bit about the job, and he said, "I've set you up a day's work experience." So I came back to London, went to the Temple, to Lamb Building, went to Chambers at Lamb Building. The senior clerk was called Eric Cooper, and if you look online, you'll find references to Eric Cooper. He was the clerk to the then Lord Chancellor, Attorney General, Elwyn Jones, I think. He was in those chambers. And I spent a day with Eric, Jean, who was the second clerk, and I came away thinking, yeah, that seems fine. You don't learn much, but you did start to sort of see barristers, but I didn't know what a barrister was. I didn't know what a solicitor was. I didn't know what a set of chambers was. No, nothing at all. Anyway, I went back to Robert and said, yeah, that's good. So he said, David, I've arranged 2 interviews, one in Chambers at Sevenstone Buildings. The clerk was Ernest Waring. Ernest was a sort of senior guy. Lincoln's Inn is a bit sort of, I don't want to be told off for this, but it was a bit sort of dusty and a bit old-fashioned. Chancery law, trusts, property, wills, and all of that are not quite the same now. And the other job was on 4th floor Gray's Inn Chambers. And Gray's Inn Chambers was a modern building, hadn't been there long. The senior clerk was in his early 30s, Leslie Page. And my rationale was I chose Gray's Inn Chambers because the senior clerk was young and the building was modern. And that was my only point to choose. And I got the job. I got offered 2 jobs. You've got 2 interviews, but it wasn't so much an interview. In other words, David, I've got you 2 jobs almost. and which one do you want to take? And I took the job with Leslie Page.
What were the interviews like? Was it more about getting to know who you were as a person? You were just out of school. You couldn't really offer anything.
I didn't have to have a CV. I didn't have to have anything other than I was wearing a suit and looked smart and all of that. My parents would have, and I always was like that, and I would have always been well turned out. My dad would have made sure that was the case. But it was more about me and whether I was going to fit in. So started there on the 16th of August, 1971. I opened a bank account, my first bank account, with a bank just down the road from Gray's Inn Chambers in Gray's Inn Road, Barclays Bank. My dad banked at Barclays, so he fixed it with the manager to see me and opened an account at Barclays. My pay was £8 a week.
That's one meal these days in London.
Well, and I could get lunch, and I'm going to talk now. I'm talking old money because it was just decimalisation came in February that year, 1971. I could get lunch for less than 25 pence. So there's a pound and 50p and 25p. So I could get lunch for 10 or 15 pence. And we used to have luncheon vouchers. That was part of the salary as a luncheon voucher. And you get 15 pence a day.
Back then, when you were a junior clerk, this was before the age of the internet. What was it like then?
The work in Chambers was commercial work. It was particularly focused on banking. It was planning, inquiries, local governments. So quite a number of the cases we were doing. It was the early days of shopping centres, shopping malls. Going back in time, it was just high street. And then suddenly the start of malls. And we were doing a lot of inquiries into these shopping centres. And also it was the time of motorways. We had the M1 in England, but nothing much else. And so you had the M25 inquiry, you had the M11 inquiry, and all these roads today. But England is one of these places where everything has to have an inquiry, and they take for months. In later life, there was the Terminal 5 inquiry at Heathrow, and they go on and on and on, and there are all these objectors about everything. And I was interested in what the members were doing. I got interested in their work in my limited way. I somehow, I don't know how, impressed them, because within 6 months there was the senior clerk, there was the junior clerk, and there was me. So I was the second junior clerk. The first junior clerk left at Christmas. So I'd been there less than 6 months, 4 months, 5 months, and I was very keen to be promoted. I don't know quite what was possessing me. What did I know? Anyway, I found myself first junior clerk by Christmas 1971. So there was the senior clerk and there was me. When the senior clerk was off, so to speak, in charge. I mean, it was quite something, age 17 going on 18. And that was a decision of Chambers. And Chambers then, I suppose, were 14, 15 strong. And that was the decision of Chambers. I think some thought it was a good idea, some weren't too sure, but I got the job. And that was really quite something, I think, at that time. But I felt it was something I really wanted. I didn't want somebody to come in above me. And someone came in below me. So suddenly I had a junior clerk below me.
I think for a lot of people listening, they would probably hear this word like clerk and wonder what that means. I mean, like the centerpiece is managing the diaries of barristers, but when you just come in, were you making coffee and tea for them? What was it like?
Yeah, it was the early days of the photocopier. And we were one of the first set of chambers to have a plain paper copier. And I had to go to Rank Xerox in Euston Road for a course on how to put in the toner, how to unjam, how to do this, how to do that. So I did a course. I always remember going for that course. So, had to do photocopying, the papers to court. Now you look at papers that go to court now, it's boxes and boxes and boxes of files. In those days, it was a file. The rest was just books, books and books and books. For me, it was books to court. And there could be 50 books because you didn't photocopy them as they do them today. You took the book and you provided the usher in court with the book list. And the book list had to be in by 9:30 to give the usher the time to get the books out for the judge and mark the page. And because I was in Gray's Inn, I had to cross Holborn, walk through Lincoln's Inn itself to the back entrance to the law courts in Carey Street. Many clerks used trolleys, but I didn't want to be seen with a trolley for whatever reason. And I used to strap these books up, 25 books in a strap, and then carry them like that across the road.
Wow.
Incredibly heavy. I'm sure my arms are longer today than they were when I was growing up, but those books to court, yeah. And in the summer, obviously not Singapore temperatures, but it's pretty hot in the summer. And you wore a suit, a tie, jacket, buttoned up, smart, because you're going to court carrying these books. And yes, so making the tea, Chambers tea every day. Members of Chambers had tea in the sort of reception area of Chambers. So I had to make tea. I had to order the biscuits, order the tea, order the coffee. If we didn't have a fair price or we didn't have a Tesco, we had to go somewhere and it got delivered. My job to make sure we had enough biscuits, enough tea, enough sugar. The milk came every day, delivered to the front door of Chambers. When I obviously stepped up a bit, that was the job of the next junior clerk. But I was never too proud. And in fact, one thing I learned that as a clerk, whether I'm the most junior or the most senior, there's nothing that I wouldn't do just to help out. So if necessary, my senior clerk would make the tea. And I've done all of that right the way through my career. If some books need to be rushed to court or something needs to be done in Chambers, whether I'm the senior clerk of the best set of chambers in the land, it doesn't matter, I go and do it. And I learned that from my senior clerk. Nothing is ever beyond you. Just dive in and help, because it's a team effort. Anybody watching this podcast, I'd recommend that they sort of research barristers, clerks. There's a lot written out there in my time or before, not so much written in today's. But an analogy is a bit like a football manager. You've got your stars and you're their life coach, you're their psychiatrist, your therapist, marriage counselor, deal with members of Chambers in a sort of breakdown situation, divorce situation, bereavement, dealing with their fees. You're advising them on the cases to take on or not to take on. You're dealing with diaries, and it's not simply one case. Sometimes you're offered a case which is perhaps slightly overlaps with the next case, but it's an unmissable case. So you're trying to manage the diaries, talking to the court as to how you can move that fixture and play with that fixture, because there are cases that can move people's careers on and get into the press, get into the law reports. And it's all about someone comes in as a pupil, joins Chambers, you're making their careers. It is said that a clerk can make or break. And I've always made in my life, never broken careers. But it's a job of many applications. Someone said, what's it like being a clerk? Or how do I become a clerk? Or what do I do in Chambers? And it is very, very difficult to explain it in a few sentences. You have to live it. And one thing it's key to do is to learn about the members of Chambers, because it's a group of self-employed people who pay into a pot to pay for the building, to pay for the staff. So everybody's self-employed. So we have cases against each other. So member against member. As a clerk, you sit in the middle. You divide your brain in half and you hear both sides of the argument, but don't talk to the other side about the other side's case. And it's important to know how people think, how they work, how they tick, how far you can push them before they explode. Because some people want to do one case at a time. Other people want to take on as many cases as they can possibly do. They're a complete nightmare because then you've got to manage that caseload. But they're there to do their work. The rest is down to the clerk. So the instructing solicitor brings the case to Chambers. The case goes to the barrister. And in the early days of clerking, it was often the clerk deciding which barrister was the best person for the job. It's different today because there's a lot more directories and internet and websites and everything. But it's how many cases can you pile on this person before they get angry? So you get to know their breaking points, their personalities.
How do you figure something like that out? Is it just through trial and error to see whether they can handle it?
I think I probably was good at. I mean, there's two things: is understanding people and also having a good memory. I was always congratulated on my memory. But as you get older, it's not as good as it was, but I do have a good memory for names.
I was listening to other clerks giving interviews as well, and they said that sometimes we will also discuss the legal aspects of a brief rather than just telling you, do this. And barristers found that very helpful. Solicitor
would ring you up and say, I got this type of case. And I've learned probably a lot more law than I like to admit. So what's it about? Who do we act for? How much money is at stake? What are we hoping as an end result? Because in the early days, you would take cases on and you wouldn't always go and consult with the member of Chambers as to whether this is something that we should be doing. That's happened in later times. But yeah, I mean, I would put my head around the door of a member of Chambers and say, I've got this case, but they want to know a bit about it. So you've got to know what it's about. And then as you get more senior in the job, and then you're starting to agree the fee. The fees is all down to the clerk. There's no member of Chambers input whatsoever. They're there just to prepare and argue the case. Everything is down to me. So I'd go to the member of Chambers and say, tell me what it's about, how much money at stake, what's your preparation time, how many witnesses, what's the money at stake, what are we trying to achieve? So then I ring the solicitor and then start talking fees. And that part of my rationale for asking sometimes very large sums of money is because one's got to know about the case, in terms of justifying the fees. You can't just say, Mr. X or Miss X, he's going to spend a week's preparation for these reasons, it needs that. There's more into it. They've got a particular style barrister, like a bit of a pop star. You can't price that on time. There is the star factor, which has a price, which you can't put a value on as to however the clients perceive that value. And it's staggering when I was agreeing fees, which were greater than the value of my house. So that's, and it sort of, then it's all goes out. It's just all about numbers. Then it's sort of, you forget, so you don't then sort of compare it with anything really sometimes. But it's what it's worth to the client.
Is it true that in terms of speaking of fees, that the collection of fees can be and still is quite an issue? You might provide a service now, and 5 years later, you still haven't been paid
Correct.
yet, and you can't chase them because you have other members who might be instructed by the same.
A bit of that, because you've got your clients going back in time. Solicitors used to be blacklisted for not paying fees. You could go to the Law Society. They could be disciplined for non-payment of fees, because there was a time when the instructing solicitor was responsible for counsel's fees. So whether the solicitor got paid or not, it was his duty to pay the barrister. That's all changed now, but that was at that time. You've got one firm that sent a lot of work to Chambers. You've got one angry member of Chambers because there's a bill been outstanding for 2 years. But you don't get them blacklisted, because otherwise the other half dozen members of Chambers, that source of work gets switched off. So that's a sort of diplomacy on my part to try and work it all through. You had solicitors at that time would collect the money from the clients. If they had a big payment from a client, keep it on the client account for a year. You made quite a good turn on the interest before they paid the barrister. That was all going on at that time. Can't happen now.
How would barristers manage? Because it depends on what kind of work they were doing. They would be paid very, very little. You
start off at the bar doing what I've always described as knockabout work. Get in front of a judge, get experience. Perhaps the analogy now is a registrar. We call them masters in the UK. We go to the county court judge. We did some magistrates work, but often on licensing as opposed to criminal. We didn't do any criminal work. I've never been in a criminal set of chambers, but it's small work, because a barrister is an advocate. So he's got to get advocate experience. And there's nothing like a young advocate in front of a nasty judge to give him really good, or him or her, good experience. We were doing a certain amount of employment work in those days, employment tribunals was going on. That was the early days in employment work. That sort of work did get paid quite well, because these were small cases, these weren't big cases. We did quite a lot of work for local authorities. I mean, fees did get paid. There were some old debts, but it wasn't unusual in those days to have fees outstanding for a year. Now it's all tightened up. You get your fees paid in 28 days. Often fees get paid ahead of the case, etc., etc. It's all changed. It's all changed because solicitors want paying quicker as well. So they pull their fees into the client, and they're obviously going to get their disbursements settled as well. That has changed. But there was fee notes that get sent in. You'd have fee notes, and you put the date of the last fee note. So it was beyond computers, but you'd put the date of the last fee note at the bottom. And there was a whole line of dates, 2 rows of dates, because you'd be billing every month. You'd write letters saying, this hasn't been settled. I wasn't very good. I'm probably not very good, still not very good, but I wasn't very good at writing letters. My senior clerk often used to have to sort of take my drafts and change them around a bit in those days. And it was picking up the phone as a junior clerk, typing the fee notes.
Speaking of fee notes, just going back a little bit, very soon after you started work first, there was the UK miners' strike and the 3-day work week, and you ended up having to write the fee notes under gas lamps. Can you share a bit about that entire period?
Yes, so this was 74 from memory. And as a result of miners' strike, there was no coal, and there was no coal for the power stations, or limited coal. So they had to ration electricity. I mean, gas was there, but it was more about electric. We would know in Chambers by something in the newspaper, I think, that if you worked in London WC1 on a Wednesday in the afternoon between 2 and 6, the power would go off. And this, I believe, it was the autumn. And so in the UK, in the autumn, progressively it gets dark by 4 in the afternoon. So we had gas lamps. My job to go and find the gas lamps, because you can imagine candles run out, gas lamps run out, or Gaz, G-A-Z was the brand. In the recent article that appeared in the Times about me, the reference to writing fee notes, it wasn't so much writing. If we did have electric typewriters, they were useless because there was no power. So we had to go back to the old sit up and beg manual typewriters. And we used carbon paper, and then it progressively, then fee notes used to get photocopied, etc., etc. But it was a challenge on working, and I can't remember how long it went on for, but certainly I do remember it quite clearly with candles and gas lamps, and making sure when you go home at night, because you could go home at the time of a power cut, to make sure that all the lights are switched off, all the candles were out, all the gas lamps were out, because it was quite a fire risk as well. It wasn't just in Chambers, it was across London. Wherever you worked, it was shop, anything. You were affected by the power cuts.
And we spoke quite a bit about solicitors earlier, and I wonder if you could share a bit about how you built that relationship with your instructing solicitors.
There was one firm that I've always been quite keen on, because there were 2 partners of that firm that really inspired me as a young person, 17, 18 years of age. There were 2 partners. They were quite sort of wild, sort of city types. And there was a guy called Michael Lee and another guy called Guy Sutton, both still alive. Michael Lee is an arbitrator now here in Singapore, 20 Essex Street. And I first met Michael in 1971/72. So I've known him for 50 years. And he was this guy in his early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, big cases, coming into Chambers to see one of the leading silk in Chambers at that time called Richard York. And I don't know, there was something about Michael that really sort of inspired me. And as life's gone on, now he's one of my great mates here in Singapore. We go drinking together, and how that relationship, I was the mere junior clerk, he was a city solicitor, a partner of Norton Rose. Guy, still in the UK, lives quite close to me back in Kent. And with Mike here, we often FaceTime with Guy back in London now. I mean, they're both in their late 70s. I'm in my late 60s, and we sort of reminisce a bit or whatever. Anyway, that's one particular relationship. But you didn't really start courting solicitors as a junior clerk. That was something that you did as a senior clerk. And it's something that came progressively, even when I became senior clerk at the age of 23, which was unheard of at that time in a set of chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Even then, those 3 years in Lincoln's Inn, you had conversations, you made sort of relationships over phone because you dealt with a lot of the same people, but you didn't head off to the West End or the city or out of London to go and visit solicitors. That came in the early 80s, because I then became senior clerk for Essex Court, as it was then known. And then I saw it more relaxed, commercial, different approach to life. And I did start to lunch with solicitors. And it was lunching then, not so much grab a coffee, which has become in later time, because lunches can take up a bit of time, coffee's quicker. But it's building relationships. And then I would get out of London, and as my newspaper article recently said, I'd head off to Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Middlesbrough, Cardiff, Birmingham, you name it, I went. Because we were getting work from the provinces, and the work was good work. There were some very good regional firms. The early days of Eversheds, Addleshaws, Diblupt and DLA, which they came later, they came in the 90s, but a lot of the firms that formed those partnerships, the Eversheds, the DLAs, the Addleshaws, I knew all the firms all joined together. Alexander Tatum of Manchester was a firm I knew well. Eversheds of Birmingham was a standalone firm. Hepworth and Chadwick of Leeds. I remember going to Manchester for the first time, and I walked into Addleshaw's offices, and I knew the partner because he'd been into Chambers in London. Chap called John Gatenby, who at one time was at Linklaters in London. And he said, David, this is amazing. You've come from London to see me in Manchester, because the clerk at Chambers over the road in Manchester, because there was the Manchester bar, clerks at the Manchester bar have never been to see me. And the fact that you've come all the way from London to see me, you can almost pack up and go home because you've made a statement and you've impressed us. I didn't just go home because I stayed for an hour and talked about Chambers. I went on to see a number of other firms. For me, I never really understood why the provincial bar never got it. That I would come from London, visit all the provincial centres. The local bars knew that I was doing this, but never thought to compete with me by doing it as well. I had a clear run. It was, I don't know, it was just a different mindset by clerks in the provinces. And I used to get teased by other clerks in London as David Greaves touting tours. It wasn't touting, it was just relationship. And so it started off in the UK and then extended overseas, because I just thought when you're ringing up a solicitor to talk fees on some big cases, you want to know the person you're talking to. It becomes a colleague. And so you can see his face, where the office is, whereabouts do they sit in Manchester, what his room looks like, you know, what his view out of his window looks like. And you have a much more comfortable conversation, because he may know that I'm a private pilot, or he may know that I like to do this or whatever. I know what he likes to do. So you can almost kick off the conversation as, you know, have you played golf recently? Because rather than just ring up and say, I want £100,000 on this brief, you warm them up first. And in fact, in some ways, by warming them up first, you put them on the back foot. And I feel I have an advantage. It's just the way I did it.
Would you say that one of your advantages is that you actually learned to fly in the 1970s?
Yeah.
And that was something that people found very interesting, came up all the time. How did that all come about?
I'd been in Chambers, so started in Chambers in August 1971. I was always aeroplane mad. And Richard York QC had an aeroplane. Wow, here's an aeroplane. And so I was immediately, you know, the great Richard York, and one of the stars of the bar at the time, but I was a junior clerk. And he could see that I had a passion for aeroplanes. I was very interested. He had what was called a single command, a Golf Alpha Victor Charlie Mike, I can remember, a VCM single command. And members of Chambers would give the clerks Christmas presents. My first Christmas in Chambers, he gave me membership to his flying club and my first flying lesson. I got the books from the Civil Aviation Authority, and I looked at what one has to do to learn to fly. And I looked at all this and I thought, completely beyond me. I really couldn't see myself getting my head around any of this. And so I didn't take my first flying lesson until July 1972. But I thought, gosh, he's gone to the trouble of giving me a flying lesson. At least I better go and use it. And the airfield was Biggin Hill, which was famous in the Second World War for Spitfires. It was only 5 miles from where I lived. And I was driving at that time. I passed my driving test in April 71, took my mum's car to Biggin Hill and had my first flying lesson. And I was completely and utterly blown away by the fact, because you go with an instructor, you're in the pilot in command seat and you're airborne, and he says, right, take the controls. We did effects of controls in the first flight, and I landed, or the instructor landed, and I went home and told my dad, this is just amazing. I want to do this. And my dad said, look, I'm going to help you. Richard York helped me. My flying lessons were £8 an hour, and I was getting £8 a week. I worked at the flying club at weekends, doing the bookings, filling the aircraft, refueling the aircraft. I made myself sort of indispensable at the flying club over time. I mean, I went there for the first time in July, and probably by August, September, I was there at weekends, taking the bookings and doing all sorts of things. I was clerking aeroplanes as opposed to clerking barristers. And so that was July 1972, and I got my license in March 73. So 9 months later, I passed out. I got my license. So it's coming up 2023. I've had my license for 50 years and I never looked back. Flying has been my life. I've been all over the place. And then Richard York, when I got my license, he said, well, go on and get your twin rating, which is 2 engines, and then you can have the keys to my aeroplane. So I used to fly his twin then. He sold his single Comanche and bought a Cessna 310, Golf Alpha Zulu Yankee Mike. I had the keys. He traveled a lot for work. He was often arguing cases in Hong Kong, Singapore. And so he just wanted his aircraft used. So I used to take his aircraft to Le Touquet in northern France. Michael Lee, who I've mentioned earlier, took him and his son Rory to France. And it's just gone onwards and upwards. I owned a share in my first aeroplane in 1988. And I own an aeroplane now, which I share with 3 other people, Golf Oscar Alpha Lima Delta. And when I could, and I was in the UK and before COVID times, fly every weekend somewhere. And I would, on a Saturday morning with one of my co-owners, we would go from Biggin Hill to Guernsey, which is one of the Channel Islands, have coffee. We go from Guernsey to Deauville in northern France, Normandy, and have a ham baguette and another coffee. And then we'd fly from Deauville back to Biggin Hill. I'd be back before midday. And I would drive home and I'd see all these people coming out of the supermarket, having done their weekly shopping and everything else. I thought, hey, I've just been to the Channel Islands, northern France, and I've come home again. I wasn't big-headed about it. It was, for me, it was a passion. I got a big kick out of it. It made my weekend. It was just a mindset. When I got back, I was very tired, used to doze in the afternoon, but it was just what I liked doing. I was the only clerk at the bar who was flying actively. So it was a conversation point. And I mentioned Guy Sutton earlier, Michael's partner at the Norton Rose. Guy was learning to fly at the same time as me. And we've done a lot of flying things together. I was the only clerk member of the Lawyers Flying Association, which was mainly solicitors. But I did that to try and attract aviation law to Chambers. So I was trying to persuade solicitors that I had massive aviation experts in Chambers. I was the aviation, if I was an expert. I didn't know any aviation law, but I thought I'd love to get aviation work into Chambers. And I did to some extent succeed because I knew a lot then. The Lawyers Flying Association knew a lot of aviation lawyers. So I've used all different methods to get work.
Having dealt with so many solicitors, what is the most effective way to market a barrister, or what are their pet peeves as well? It's
all about my relationship with solicitors and their relationship with me, and trust and judgment. And I would go to see solicitors and they might say, hey, David, I got this case. Who do you think is the best person in Chambers on this type of work or that type of work? And because I said it and because they'd known me and trusted me, they would come to me with cases. And I can't make any lawyer, any solicitor instruct any member of Chambers. It's a matter for the solicitor, the lawyer, and for the client to agree. What I can do is open the door, make the introduction, because once the solicitor and the barrister are together, it's then up to the barrister to do his or her stuff. And if it goes well, it doesn't always go well. Sometimes cases are a bit of a disaster, but it doesn't mean the relationship's at the end. It's just the case. As long as you've done your best, that often brings the next case. For me, it was relationships. It's increased now with the modern bar now build their own relationships because it's acceptable to go out. In the early days, it wasn't acceptable for a barrister to wine and dine a solicitor. That was thought not acceptable. It was certainly unacceptable, and I never did it. Just go knocking on doors. I never cold called. I always had someone to make an introduction by saying, you ought to meet David Grief, or I was building the relationships within firms. But it is just about relationships. And that's the way I've always been.
Wasn't there a change to the Bar's Code of Conduct where barristers could then start accepting privately funded work directly? Do you feel that changed the nature of your work?
It is a change. So direct access, as it's called. Yeah. So there was direct professional access where surveyors, accountants, and the likes of that had licensed direct access. So suddenly one was also marketing, in my case, accountants, because we did in Essex Court Chambers, as we eventually became, work in the indirect tax world, VAT. So there were accountants to be marketed because clients would go to accountants. Accountants wouldn't need to go to solicitors because they can instruct directly. So in some ways, solicitors used to get a bit peeved with the bar because they suddenly had direct access. And then there was direct access from the man or woman on the street to the bar. We didn't do that because suddenly you're turning yourself into being solicitor / advocate, and so much more was required. So we've always done professional direct access or work directly from in-house lawyers, the likes of Shell, for example. We had very good relationships with Shell because they were all in-house solicitors. And so I would be courting in-house to come direct to the bar. But yes, that was a change. I mean, going back to the 70s, and I talked about planning, local authorities could come direct to the bar. So you have your solicitor within Northamptonshire County Council or whatever it is. They have their own legal team. They could come direct to the bar.